One of the deep, dark secrets of America's past has finally come to light. Starting in the early 1900s, hundreds of thousands of American children were warehoused in institutions by state governments, and the federal government did nothing to stop it. The justification? The kids had been labeled feeble-minded and were put away in conditions which can only be described as unspeakable. Now, a new book, The State Boys' Rebellion by Michael D'Antonio, reveals even more. A large proportion of the kids who were locked up were not retarded at all. They were simply poor, uneducated kids with no place to go, who ended up in institutions like the Fernald School in Waltham, Massachusetts. The Fernald School is the oldest institution of its kind in the country. At its peak, some 2,500 people were confined here at a time, most of them children, all of them called feeble-minded, whether they were or not. The people who ran Fernald back in the bad old days are no longer alive, but many of the victims still are. Victims like Fred Boyce, who was locked up here for 11 years. He came back to Fernald with us.
We thought for a long time that we belonged there, that we were not part of this species. We thought we were some kind of, people that wasn't supposed to be born.
And that was precisely the idea. The Fernald School and others like it were part of a popular American movement in the early 20th century. It was called the eugenics movement. The idea was to separate people considered to be genetically inferior from the rest of society to prevent them from reproducing. Eugenics is usually associated with Nazi Germany, but in fact, it started here in America. Not only that, it continued here long after Hitler's Germany was in ruins. At the height of the movement in the 1920s and 30s, exhibits were set up at fairs to teach people about eugenics. It was good for America, good for the human race. That was the message. Michael D'Antonio, the author of the book The State Boys' Rebellion, says it wasn't just a movement, it was government policy.
People were told, we can be rid of all disease, we can lower the crime rate, we can increase the wealth of our nation, if only we keep certain people from having babies.
He says back then, schools tested children regularly. Those classified as feeble-minded got a one-way ticket to Fernald, or to one of the more than 100 institutions like it. You say feeble-minded, another word used was moron.
Idiot, imbecile, and moron were all medical terms. They were used to define various levels of retardation or disability. Moron was coined to describe children who were almost normal.
Do you have any notion as to what percentage of the people who were institutionalized were severely retarded and how many were not?
I would estimate that at least 50% would function in today's world well.
Take Fred Boyce. He was just 8 years old in 1949 when his foster mother died and the state of Massachusetts committed him to Fernald. Fred's records from Fernald show they labeled him as a moron, even though tests showed his intelligence was within the normal range. Not bad for a boy with no education at all. Do you know why the state recommended that you come?
It was the easy way out. They didn't have to look for homes for you, so they could just dump you off in these human warehouses and just let you rot, And that's what they did. They let us rot.
They said you were feeble-minded?
Yeah.
You weren't feeble-minded. They kept you here 11 years.
Of the most precious time that you have as a child.
Most of the school is closed now, including Fred Boyce's old dorms. They'll be torn down soon, the relics of a childhood without joy. About 36 children slept in each room with the beds jammed together. The children received little education and less affection. And how long would they stay at Fernald? The kids were told they could be here for life.
I kind of thought for a while maybe there was something wrong with me, or why would I be here?
There was, in fact, nothing wrong with Joe Almeida, but that didn't prevent him from getting swept into the system. He was an abused child, and when he was 8, his father took him for a drive to the Fernald School and told him to wait in the hallway.
I said, wait a minute, Dad, where are you going, He goes, oh, you wait right there. He goes, I got to go get the car. And he went, and that was the last I seen of him.
Joe had no idea where he was, no idea that he now wore an invisible label which read moron. He ended up in the same dorm as Fred Boyce. They spent their mornings in the schoolroom, at least that's what the room was called.
It was a school in name only. A child would experience the first year of school 5 or 6 times in a row. He would read the same Dick and Jane reader and never make any progress because the school wasn't equipped to actually educate children. It was there as a sort of holding pen.
The children did most of the manual labor at the school. What kind of work did they do?
The kids at Fernald raised the vegetables that they ate. They sewed the soles on the shoes that they wore. They manufactured the brooms that they used to sweep the floor.
He says the school made sure at least 30% of the kids admitted had normal or near normal intelligence. The school needed those kids to work.
You had to have somebody with a certain level of intelligence in order to run this place.
In effect, you were very cheap labor.
Definitely. And I can remember like being out in the gardens from morning to in the sun.
Didn't have any unions, did you?
Didn't have much of anything, you know.
Joe Almeida had an unusual job, and the fruits of his labor are still there 50 years later.
My job was to cut these up.
What he cut up were the brains of severely retarded people who had died at Fernald. He cut them into thin slices so they could be studied by scientists. Nothing ever came of the research, but the bits of brains are still there.
They're still sitting here years later. I mean, what was it all for?
Worse than the work, he says, was the abuse he suffered from the attendants who staffed the place.
They had what they call Red Cherry Day, okay? What Red Cherry Day was, they'd sit us all in a circle, and they'd call you up alphabetically. And lucky me, my name is what? Almeida. You'd get up in front of all these kids, and you'd pull down your pants, and you'd pull down your underpants. They'd make you turn around, and they'd whack your ass with this branch until it was red like a cherry.
Few of the attendants showed any kindness, he says, but some of them should have been institutionalized themselves.
This Mr. Rozier used to have 3 or 4 kids urinate in a bucket, and she'd have them throw it in your face. I mean, these people were sick that worked here.
Sexual